Hey you, ready for another deep dive? Today we're looking at former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's injury in Luxembourg. Sounds kind of, well, random, right? But we've got articles from Fox News, The Guardian, and CNN. And it turns out there's more to this story than meets the eye.
You got that right. It really gets you thinking about the demands on those public figures, especially when they're serving in their 80s.
Yeah, and the way the news unfolded is interesting too. First, Fox News was all about the trip itself. Commemorating the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge.
Right.
But then CNN came out with the detail that she'd fallen on stairs and was hospitalized.
And later had to be medevaced to a U.S. military hospital in Germany. Makes you realize it was pretty serious. And this all ties into something we're seeing more and more of, don't you think? Politicians serving at an older and older age.
Yeah, for sure.
Pelosi's 84, and this was just days after 82-year-old Senator Mitch McConnell also had a fall.
It's like, wow, are we seeing a pattern here?
Mm.
And you know what else is interesting from Fox News? They highlighted Pelosi's personal connection to World War II. Her uncle actually fought in it.
Oh, wow.
So this trip was probably very meaningful for her on a personal level.
Definitely adds another layer to the whole thing. It's a good reminder, you know? Sometimes we forget these figures we see debating on TV, making big decisions. They've got personal histories, families, and, yeah, maybe some physical limitations, too.
We kind of forget they're human.
Exactly.
And speaking of human limitations, The Guardian pointed out that Pelosi was just reelected. She'll be serving well into her 80s. Can she actually keep up with the demands of that job? I mean, think about it.
Yeah, it's a valid question. The travel, the late nights, the constant public appearances, the pressure of every decision, it's grueling for anyone, let alone someone in their 80s.
Exactly. That trip to Luxembourg wasn't just sightseeing. A whole congressional delegation, ceremonies, meetings.
Oh, yeah, definitely not a vacation.
Exhausting just thinking about it.
And this all plays into something The Guardian mentioned, the upcoming election. They're predicting a narrow Republican majority when President-elect Trump returns to the White House.
So every vote matters even more.
Absolutely. The pressure just keeps ratcheting up.
So where does that leave us? I mean, is this something the average person should even care about?
Well, I think it's important to consider both sides. We want experience, right? Leaders who've seen it all, done it all. But at the same time, we have to be realistic about the toll these jobs take. It's not just about age, it's about the human factor.
It's like we expect them to be superhuman, but they're not.
No, they're not. And maybe that's where we need to start rethinking things a bit.
Yeah, maybe we need to reevaluate what we expect from those who serve in public office.
Exactly. And that gets us to another interesting point. How these kinds of situations with Pelosi and McConnell affect how voters see aging politicians. Do we start doubting them, worrying they can't handle it? It's a whole other can of worms that will open when we come back. You know, before we even get to public perception, I keep thinking about that detail from CNN about Pelosi needing to be medevaced to Germany.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Really puts things in perspective, doesn't it? Here's this incredibly powerful woman, right? Held one of the highest positions in the U.S.
Right.
And suddenly she's just vulnerable, facing a health crisis like anyone else.
It does make it more real. Like if someone like Pelosi, with all her resources, is susceptible to these setbacks, what does that say about the rest of us? You know, with regular jobs and all that stress.
Exactly. It's the stress, the pressure, maybe not enough sleep, having to make so many decisions all the time.
Yeah, those things don't just disappear because you're in Congress, do they?
No. And it makes me wonder, are we doing enough to support people in these high-pressure roles? We're so focused on the politics, the winning and losing.
Right.
Do we ever stop to think about the human cost?
Probably not as much as we should. I mean, we expect those leaders to always be on to function perfectly.
Exactly. But what about their mental health, their well-being? This isn't just about politicians either. It's CEOs, teachers, frontline workers.
Anyone with a really demanding job, basically.
Right. Anyone carrying a lot of responsibilities. So what do we do? How do we change things?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
Well, I think it starts with just being aware, recognizing that these pressures, these demands, they take a toll.
Okay. But awareness alone doesn't actually solve anything, does it? What can people actually do?
That's a good point. I think on a personal level, it's about prioritizing self-care, knowing your limits, setting boundaries.
And not being afraid to ask for help.
Right, absolutely. But that's just one piece. What about organizations, institutions? What can they do to create a healthier environment for their leaders?
Yeah, that's where it gets tricky, I think.
For sure. We're talking about things like work-life balance, offering mental health resources, creating a culture where vulnerability is okay.
All good things in theory, but I'm not so sure how realistic those are, especially in politics where it's all so competitive.
I get your skepticism, but honestly, I think it's not just possible, it's necessary. If we want the best people in these roles, we got to make sure the system isn't grinding them down.
Okay, you've got a point there. But let's circle back to those aging politicians specifically. How do voters even perceive that?
Public perception. Now, that's a whole other discussion. There's this tension, you see. On the one hand, we value experience, the wisdom that comes with age.
Makes sense.
But then we've also got all these preconceived notions about what happens as we get older.
Like, we want those experienced leaders, but then we start worrying about them being able to keep up.
You hit the nail on the head. And an incident like Pelosi's fall, as unfortunate as it is, it feeds into those anxieties.
So how do we move past that? Wanting experience, but then being afraid of, I don't know, the downsides of age.
I think we have to start by challenging our assumptions. Stop with the generalizations about getting older. Everyone ages differently.
So look at each candidate individually, basically.
Exactly. Don't just go by their age. Look at their cognitive function, their health, their track record.
Judge them on their actual abilities, not just some number.
You got it. And I think that's a key takeaway for all of us, especially going into this election. Don't get stuck on age.
Right, right.
Look at the whole picture, the experience, the policies, and yes, the health and energy of the individual.
Make an informed choice.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this part of our dive, I want to leave everyone with a thought. How can we, as individuals, be part of a more informed conversation about age and leadership? How do we get past ageism? That's something to think about.
Definitely something to chew on. And we'll be back with some final thoughts after a quick break. Wow, we covered a lot of ground today. Pelosi's injury, the demands of these jobs, the toll it takes on everyone.
It all goes back to something we talked about earlier, I think, that human element.
Yeah, for sure. Easy to get lost in the political battles and forget that, at the end of the day, these are people we're talking about.
Absolutely. And they're just as human as the rest of us, just as vulnerable. And I think that's where we need to, as a society, start shifting our perspective a little.
How do you mean?
Well, we tend to have this very limited view of what leadership looks like, you know?
Yeah.
Strength, resilience, always making those tough calls, never showing weakness.
And you're saying that's not really the full picture?
Not even close. Real leadership, true leadership,
Yeah.
it requires vulnerability, empathy, the ability to connect with people on a human level.
So it's not just about being tough and decisive all the time. It's about being human.
You got it. It's about recognizing that everyone has their limits. Everyone needs support sometimes. And that it's okay to ask for help. In fact, it's a sign of strength, not weakness.
You know, that's really hitting home for me right now, thinking about my own life and how much pressure I feel sometimes to be on all the time, never show any cracks. It's exhausting.
And it's not sustainable. We've got to create a culture where it's okay to be human, where people feel safe to struggle sometimes, to ask for help when they need it. And that starts with each of us.
So where do we even begin? How do we make those changes?
Self-awareness, I think. Recognizing our own limits, what we need, practicing self-care, setting boundaries, and not being afraid to reach out when we're struggling.
And then, like, extending that same compassion to others,
Right.
especially those in leadership roles.
Yeah.
Checking in on them, offering support, remembering that they're human, too.
Exactly. It's about creating a more compassionate and supportive world, where people are valued not just for what they do, but for who they are.
I'm so glad we had this conversation today. It really got me thinking, not just about political leaders, but leadership in all aspects of life.
And I hope it's given our listeners some things to ponder, too.
For sure. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we always like to leave you with something to think about. And today, it's this. How can we, each of us, create a more human, more sustainable approach to leadership in our own lives and in the world around us?
That's the question, isn't it?
Something to keep in mind as you go about your day. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.